Hey guys, Dimension Master Studios here, how y'all doing? So, I'm sure as you guys know, when it comes to Crystalized, this season is very controversial when it comes to the fan base, and when it comes to Crystalized, there's a lot of people who don't like this season, and I am one of these people. After part 2 of Crystalized came out, I made a 5-part review of the season, and I was pretty negative towards the season in that video. However, with it being 6 months later, I decided that I wanted to re-review Crystalized for you guys. Mainly because my opinions on certain things have changed when it comes to Crystalized. Also, I have more things to say when it comes to Crystalized. However, are my opinions on Crystalized more positive? No. If you guys saw my tier list video, then you know that I think Crystalized is the second worst Ninjago season of all time. And in today's video, I wanted to talk about this season and why I personally really don't like this season. And with all that out of the way, let's get into this whole thing. This is my review for Crystalized 6 months later. Let's get into this whole thing. However, before I talk about anything negative when it comes to Crystalized, I want to talk about the positives and I want to go over the stuff that I liked during the season. Starting off with the production. In my opinion, when it comes to Crystalized, this season has amazing animation, music, and voice acting. And I'd even argue it has some of the best music, voice acting, and animation in the entirety of the show. I feel like when it comes to the animation, it looks really good, especially when it comes to the fight scenes. I think that when it comes to the soundtrack, it was also handled really well during the season. And when it comes to the voice acting, that was also really good, with all the voice actors doing an absolutely amazing job during this season. Although, to be fair, I think the voice actors always do an amazing job when it comes to the seasons. However, there's one voice actor in particular who I want to talk about, and that is Andrew Francis, the voice actor for Cole. For those of you who don't know, Cole's original voice actor, Kirby Morrow, unfortunately passed away a few years ago, and Andrew Francis stepped in order to voice Cole. And in my opinion, Andrew Francis did an absolutely amazing job voicing Cole during this season. I like that when it comes to Andrew Francis voicing Cole, he does his own take on Cole's voice and he's not doing an imitation of Kirby's voice, but it still feels like Cole. I think that's amazing. And like I said, when it comes to Andrew Francis, I feel like he did an absolutely amazing job voicing Cole during this season. And like I said, the voice actors in general all did an amazing job. And overall, when it comes to the production value of the season, I think it was honestly really good. Another thing that I liked about Crystalized was the Council of the Crystal King. In my opinion, the Council was honestly handled well during this season, for the most part. I honestly really like the idea that the Council is made up of all these different villains from all across Ninjago. I think that's honestly a really cool idea. Plus, at the same time, I really like that when it comes to the Council, it's made up of these big personalities who are all clashing with each other. I think that's honestly something really funny. Also, the comedy in general during this season, I feel, was honestly handled really well. And when it comes to the Council, I really enjoyed seeing their interactions with each other, especially when it came to Asphira and King Vangelis. Their interactions in particular were definitely funny. And overall, when it comes to the Council, honestly, I really enjoyed them during this season. For the most part, there were a couple of issues that I had with the Council, but I'll get back to those later on during the video. Another thing that I want to talk about is some of the episodes. In my opinion, when it comes to Crystallize, a lot of the episodes weren't that good, but there were some episodes that, in my opinion, were genuinely great in one way or another. You had episodes like Fall of the Monastery and Brave but Foolish, which had absolutely amazing fight scenes. The episode The Benefit of Grief had a really great message when it came to emotions, and I feel like that gave us the first truly great Zane story since the Ice Emperor storyline. And when it comes to the episode Safe Haven, I honestly really like what that episode did with Jake. Overall, when it comes to Crystallized, even though not all of the episodes were that great, in my opinion, for the episodes that were good, they were honestly handled pretty well during the season. And finally, there is one more major positive that I want to talk about when it comes to this season, and that is Garmadon. In my opinion, Garmadon was handled pretty well during this season, and honestly, he was my favorite part about the season. For starters, when it came to Garmadon, he was made a lot more comedic during the season, and honestly, I didn't mind that. You could tell that when it comes to Garmadon, he was made more like his movie counterpart during the season, and for me personally, I liked movie Garmadon, so like I said, I didn't have any problems with Garmadon being made more comedic during the season. However, that's not it. Another big reason why I really like Garmadon during the season is because of his story. When it comes to Garmadon, his story during the events of Crystalized revolves around the idea of him being an Oni, yet despite that, he's actively trying to change and he wants to become a better person. I think that's honestly something pretty interesting when it comes to Garmadon. Plus, at the same time, I feel like that's a natural continuation of his storyline that we saw during the events of the trilogy. During the events of the trilogy, we basically only saw Garmadon as this really evil villain who wanted to do nothing but take over Ninjago and conquer it all. That was until Season 10, where we slowly started to see Garmadon change his mind on certain things, realizing that there's more to life than survival, eventually leaving the monastery by the end of the season. So when it comes to Crystalized, like I said, it feels like a natural continuation of that storyline. Plus, at the same time, I honestly really like that when it comes to Garmadon, he's doing whatever he can to help Lloyd, and I feel like that honestly makes a lot of sense. Out of every character in the show, Lloyd was obviously the most affected when it came to Garmadon's resurrection, with him being hurt a lot by Garmadon. And when it comes to Garmadon, you can tell that he's trying to make it up to Lloyd in any way that he can. Honestly, I did enjoy that. Also, when it comes to Garmadon during the season, I really like how Christopher is meant to act as a stand-in for Lloyd. I feel like that was honestly handled well during the season. Plus, at the same time, I honestly really enjoyed seeing Garmadon in his Oni form during the season, and when it came to the fight scenes he got involved with, I honestly feel like they were handled really well. There were a couple issues that I had with Garmadon related stuff during the season, but I'm going to talk about that later on when I get into the negatives. And overall, when it comes to Garmadon, like I said, I honestly feel like he was the best part of the season, and honestly, I really liked him during Crystalized. And that's basically it when it comes to the positives. So now let's talk about the negatives, and let's go over the stuff that I didn't like during the season. For starters, let's talk about the ninja, because in my opinion, the ninja weren't handled well at all during Crystalized. When it comes to Kai and Jay, I feel like the two of them both suffered from the exact same problem. The two of them both had a very interesting setup for storylines during the season, however, the season didn't do anything with these storylines. And when it came to Kai and Jay, that storyline was them feeling grief over Nia's sacrifice. This was set up a lot during the first couple episodes of Crystalized, but nothing really happened as a result of that. The most that we got was a very short fight scene between the two of them, and then after Nia came back, nothing happened with Kai and Jay. The two of them just went back to being themselves, and their grief over Nia's sacrifice was barely brought up at all. In fact, when it came to Kai, he brought up Nia's sacrifice once after she was brought back, and him and Nia barely interacted with each other during the season. Once again, when it comes to Kai and Jay, I feel like the two of them honestly had the setup for a really interesting storyline, but nothing happened with that storyline. And when it came to Kai, there were occasional things that happened with him, but for the most part, there wasn't anything major. And so when it comes to Kai and Jay during the season, I don't think either of them were handled that well during the season. As for Zane and Cole, I feel like the two of them weren't handled that poorly during the season, and if anything, I'd say that when it comes to the two of them, they were probably handled the best during the season. When it comes to Cole, there wasn't anything that major that happened with him during the season. He reunited the team at the very beginning of the season, and then he called for Vanya's help towards the end, and that was pretty much it. Again, there wasn't anything that major that happened with Cole over the season, but overall, I don't think Cole was handled poorly during Crystalized. And when it comes to Zane, I'd honestly say that out of all the ninja, he was probably handled the best out of all of them, and that was because of his emotion storyline during part 1 of Crystalized. Zane's emotion storyline during part 1 of Crystalized, I feel, was honestly something pretty interesting, with Zane turning off his emotions as his own way of coping with Nia's sacrifice. I think that's honestly something pretty interesting. And the storyline ends up coming to an end during the episode The Benefit of Grief, where Zane ends up realizing that all emotions, even negative ones, are useful because they can help us make better decisions in the future. And I feel like this message is honestly something really interesting when it comes to the show, and I feel like this episode honestly brought a satisfying conclusion to the Zane emotion storyline. Plus, at the same time, I feel like this was honestly the first good Zane storyline that we had gotten since the Ice Emperor storyline back during season 11. And overall, when it comes to Zane during part 1, I feel like he was honestly handled well. However, there is an issue that I have with this storyline. After Zane reactivates his emotions, nothing happens. Zane basically goes back to being the exact same character that we knew, and nothing major happens with him. And after his emotions are reactivated, there isn't anything major that happens with Zane for the rest of the season outside of stuff that happens with the rest of the team. Now, yes, there was actually one thing that happened with Zane later on during the season, but I'm going to be talking about that later on during the video. And finally, that brings us to the last two ninja, Lloyd and Nia. And I don't think Lloyd and Nia were handled well at all during this season. And I honestly feel like when it comes to Crystalized, this is where Lloyd and Nia were at their worst. Starting off with Nia, things obviously changed in a big way at the ending of Seabound when Nia sacrificed herself and she merged with the ocean, eventually leaving the team. And when it came to Crystalized, I was interested in seeing where the storyline would end up taking Nia. However, when it came to Crystalized, it took Nia in a very strange direction. For starters, when it came to Nia, she returned relatively early on during the season and she became a human again. However, she didn't have any powers, and I feel like this is honestly something pretty interesting, because this allows there to still be consequences from Nia's sacrifice. Plus, there are some interesting directions that Nia's character can be taken in. And when it comes to Nia, she ended up becoming Samurai X once again. And honestly, I feel like that's a really interesting idea when it comes to Nia. We haven't seen her as Samurai X in a really long time. And I think it's also pretty interesting because when it comes to Nia's character, a big part of her character is the idea that you don't need powers in order to do amazing things. And that is exactly what we saw when it came to Samurai X. Nia was able to do all these amazing things and she didn't have any powers. And she was able to do all that amazing stuff because she is Nia. She was being herself. So Nia becoming Samurai X, in my opinion, was a pretty interesting idea. However, after Nia became Samurai X once again, the show handled Nia in a very strange way. After Nia becomes Samurai X again during the events of Crystalized, the season is constantly presenting this idea that Nia isn't capable of doing anything without her powers, and she's only able to fight back against the Overlord's forces when she has her powers. And overall, I don't think this makes any sense because it completely goes against Nia's character. Remember, a big thing for Nia's character is the idea that you don't need powers in order to do amazing things. You can still be a hero all on your own. Yet, when it comes to this season, Nia is only able to be a hero when she has her powers. And that doesn't make a lot of sense in my opinion. And during part 2 of Crystalized, the mechanic is constantly fixating on this idea that Nia isn't a real hero unless she has her powers. And the thing is, the show doesn't prove him wrong. Because like I said, whenever Nia fights back against the Overlord's forces, she isn't able to do anything unless she has her powers. Meanwhile, when it comes to other characters who also don't have powers, they're able to fight back against the Overlord's forces perfectly fine. Take Pixel, for example. During the episode Return of the Ice Emperor, she was able to fight back against multiple Vengestone warriors with nothing but a sewer cap, and she was perfectly fine. Meanwhile, when it comes to Nia, a trained ninja who's been fighting against bad guys for years, she's barely able to do anything against the Overlord's forces. And when she does fight back against against the mechanic towards the end of the season, she's not even the one who defeats him. Okino is the one who defeats the mechanic. Also, at the same time, when it comes to Nia, when she does fight back against the mechanic, she does it by using her powers. And once again, this basically proves the mechanic right. Nia's only able to do stuff if she does have her powers. Something that doesn't make any sense because that completely goes against Nia's character and the idea that you don't need powers in order to do these amazing things. And overall, when it comes to Nia during Crystalized, I honestly don't think she was handled well. I feel like the idea of her becoming Samurai X again is an interesting idea. However, the season constantly showing that Nia is incapable of doing anything unless she has her powers, that doesn't make any sense at all, and it completely goes against Nia's character. But now, let's talk about Lloyd, and I really don't think this guy was handled well at all during the events of Crystalized. During part 1 of Crystalized, there wasn't anything major going on with Lloyd's character. There was something interesting that we saw at the very beginning of the season where Lloyd didn't want to take responsibility for anything bad happening, which I feel like is a pretty interesting idea, but the season did absolutely nothing with that storyline. However, things took a big change at the end of episode 12, where it was revealed that Harumi was alive, and after this happened, I honestly felt like Lloyd's character went on a downward spiral during the season. Because after Harumi was brought back, all throughout the events of Crystalized, Lloyd was constantly fixating on the idea of Harumi changing and her becoming a better person. And this doesn't make any sense at all for two reasons. For starters, there is all the horrible and terrible things that Harumi has done. Harumi has done so many terrible and awful things, not just to Lloyd, but in general. And when it comes to Crystalized, we keep on seeing that. Harumi ends up doing these terrible things all throughout the events of Crystalized. Stuff like trying to kill everyone close to Lloyd, uniting a team of Ninjago's greatest villains, resurrecting the Overlord, help taking over Ninjago by force, and so much more. However, despite all of that and all of the terrible things that Harumi did during seasons 8 and 9, Lloyd has absolutely no issue with Harumi changing and her becoming a better person. In fact, during episode 16 of Crystalized, Harumi tells Lloyd that the monastery has been blown up and everyone inside of it is dead, and Lloyd understandably is angry about that. However, by the end of the episode, Lloyd has absolutely no issue with Harumi changing, and this doesn't make any sense. However, the other big reason why Lloyd fixating on the idea of Harumi changing doesn't make any sense is because of his Wild Brain arc. Starting in Season 11, Lloyd went through this massive character arc revolving around him getting over Harumi and moving on from her. And we saw this during Season 11, Season 12, Season 13, and The Island. And like I said, this arc was dedicated to Lloyd getting over Harumi. And in my opinion, when it comes to this arc, it was honestly handled really well, with Lloyd finally being able to heal from all the trauma that Harumi put him through, and at the same time, Lloyd was finally able to put the past behind him and he could move on with his life in a healthy way. However, during the events of Crystalized, that entire character arc is completely thrown out the window. And we end up seeing that during episode 14, where we get this conversation between Lloyd and Harumi. During the episode, Lloyd says, "You tricked me once," and Harumi tells Lloyd, "And you think you learned from it, but you haven't, clearly." And when it comes to this line, I feel like it could have worked if for the rest of the season it showed that Harumi was wrong about Lloyd. However, over the events of the season, we don't see that, because during the events of Crystalized, Lloyd keeps on fixating on the idea of Harumi changing, and at the same time, he keeps on falling for her manipulation, essentially proving her right. And overall, when it comes to Lloyd's dynamic with Harumi, I don't think it was handled well at all. And also, it doesn't make any sense considering everything we've seen from Lloyd from Season 8 up to here. Again, it doesn't make any sense. However, that's not all, because Harumi isn't the only character who Lloyd has a major dynamic with, because the other character who Lloyd has a major dynamic with during the season is Garmadon. Now, like I said earlier, when it comes to Garmadon, his storyline revolved around the idea of him being an Oni, yet despite that, he's actively trying to change and he's trying to become a better person. However, when it comes to Lloyd during this season, he is actively against the idea of Garmadon changing, saying that because he's an Oni, he isn't able to change. He says that the Oni are incapable of caring and all they do is destroy. And this doesn't make any sense for a lot of different reasons. For starters, when it comes to Lloyd saying that the Oni aren't capable of caring and all they do is destroy, we know for a fact that isn't true. We've seen Mistake. She was a full-blooded Oni, yet despite that, she did care about other people and she wanted to help out the Resistance in order to save Ninjago. In fact, she even sacrificed herself in order to help save Ninjago, and the reveal of her being an Oni actually had a big impact on Lloyd. So when it comes to Lloyd acting this way during this season, it doesn't make any sense. Also, at the same time, there's a big question that I have when it comes to Lloyd's dynamics during the season. Why is Lloyd perfectly fine with Harumi changing, but not Garmadon? Think about it. When it comes to Harumi during the events of Crystalized, she does nothing but hurt Lloyd and she causes him so much pain and suffering. In fact, during episode 14, we even saw that Lloyd cried as a result of Harumi's actions. The exact same thing that happened to him during the season 8 finale. However, despite all of that, Lloyd has absolutely no issue with Harumi changing. Meanwhile, when it comes to Garmadon, who's actively trying to change and wants to become a better person, and he's even helping out the ninja, Lloyd is actively against the idea of him changing, and it doesn't make any sense. And even during episode 27, where Lloyd apologizes to Garmadon, the most he ends up giving Garmadon is a maybe, and then during episode 28, he goes right back to being angry at Garmadon. And the two of them don't have a satisfying conclusion to their dynamic at all. In fact, there really isn't any conclusion to their dynamic at all during the season. The closest we get is Garmadon handing Lloyd a piece of wood during the final episode, and that's pretty much it. And overall, when it comes to Lloyd's dynamics during the season, I honestly don't think they were handled well at all. Now, yes, when it comes to Garmadon, you could make the argument saying that when it comes to Lloyd, he was angry at him because of all the terrible stuff that he did during the Oni trilogy. But here's the thing, that's not the reason why Lloyd was angry at Garmadon during the season. Lloyd was angry at Garmadon during the season because he was an Oni, not because of the actions he did during the trilogy. Plus, at the same time, that also leads into the other big issue. If Lloyd was angry at Garmadon because of the stuff he did during the trilogy, then how come the same thing doesn't apply to Harumi? How come Lloyd isn't angry at Harumi because of all the stuff that she did during the trilogy, but he's angry at Garmadon because of all the stuff that he did? It doesn't make any sense. And overall, when it comes to Lloyd's dynamics during the season, I honestly don't think they were handled well at all, and they completely contradicted each other. And I honestly feel like when it comes to Lloyd's dynamics during this season, they really should have been switched around, with Lloyd trying to help Garmadon become a better person, and him being against the idea of Harumi changing. I honestly feel like that would have made a lot more sense, and it would have been a lot more consistent with Lloyd's character. However, that's not it, because there's one other big thing when it comes to Lloyd that I didn't like during the season, and that was Oni Lloyd. Oni Lloyd as a concept was set up during episode 14 of Crystalized, where we saw Lloyd access his Oni powers for the first time, and for the remainder of the season, the idea of Oni Lloyd was constantly built up, with the big idea being that Oni Lloyd would be the thing to eventually defeat the Overlord. And I was really looking forward to this idea because I think that Oni Lloyd is a really cool concept when it comes to the show. We've always seen Lloyd using stuff like the power of the dragon in order to fight back against bad guys. So Lloyd using the power of his Oni side in order to fight back is a really interesting idea. And during the final episode of Crystalized, we got a chance to see that, with Lloyd tapping into his Oni power and using it to fight against the Overlord, and we got this for 20 seconds. Oni Lloyd was barely in the season, and the season built up the idea of Oni Lloyd for half of it. So that's half a season's worth of build-up for barely any payoff in the end. And there's something about Oni Lloyd that I'm really confused on. Why was there all this build-up if we were barely going to get Oni Lloyd? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Also, at the same time, I'm really confused as to why Lloyd didn't want to access his Oni side. During the events of Crystalized, we're presented with this idea that when it comes to Lloyd, he doesn't want to tap into his Oni side because he doesn't want to end up evil like Garmadon, and that is something that I can understand, except here's the thing. Lloyd already went through a storyline where he was worried that he would end up like a villain, and Lloyd didn't end up like a villain. We saw that happen during the Ice chapter. During the events of Season 11, when Lloyd looked in the mirror at the Explorers Club, he saw himself becoming like his dad. And during the events of the Ice chapter, we saw Lloyd going through the storyline revolving around him not ending up like his dad, not ending up as a villain. And we ended up seeing that with Vex. Vex was meant to represent this dark reflection of Lloyd, showing what Lloyd could end up like if he gave in to his paranoia and his trust issues. However, over the course of the Ice chapter, Lloyd didn't give in to his paranoia and trust issues, and as a result, Vex was defeated and Lloyd didn't end up like a bad guy. So when it comes to Lloyd acting this way during Crystalized, it doesn't make any sense. Why is Lloyd worried that he'll end up like a villain if he already went through a storyline overcoming his fear of becoming a bad guy? It doesn't make any sense at all. Plus, at the same time, like I said earlier, why was there all this build-up revolving around Oni Lloyd if Oni Lloyd was barely going to get any screen time? In my opinion, that really doesn't make a lot of sense at all. And overall, when it comes to Oni Lloyd, I honestly don't think this concept was handled well when it comes to the show. And when it comes to Lloyd in general during this season, I really didn't like the way that he was handled. Moving on from the ninja though, let's talk about the other characters during this season. And I feel like when it comes to the returning characters during the season, for the most part, they were handled well. There were some returning characters who I did enjoy during the season, like the Council, like I said earlier. There was also the Overlord. I feel like he was honestly handled well during the season. I like seeing Skylar back. And overall, like I said, I feel like most of the returning characters were handled well. When it comes to the new characters, on the other hand, honestly, I didn't think they were handled that well. There were a couple of new characters who I liked, such as Mr. F and Sally. However, at the same time, there were some new characters who I honestly didn't like during the season. Like, for example, the new ninja. Honestly, I wasn't a big fan of the new ninja during the season. I thought they were pretty obnoxious during the season. Also, there's a pretty big issue that I have with the new ninja. We learned basically nothing about these guys during the season. They just show up at multiple points during the season, and like I said, we never learn anything about them. We never see their identities or learn their names. They just show up and fight against bad guys a few times, and that's it. And I'm wondering, when it comes to the new ninja, what exactly was the point of these guys in the first place? Overall, I honestly didn't think the new ninja were handled that well. There was also Hound Dog McBrog, and he was also a character who I wasn't a big fan of during the season. I also thought he was pretty obnoxious. And then there was Mayor Trustable, and I really don't like this guy. After the new ninja got involved in one fight where they defeated a bunch of criminals, the mayor decided that the new ninja are better than the original ninja, even though the original ninja had been fighting against bad guys and they've been saving Ninjago for a really long time. Again, after the new ninja got involved in one fight, the mayor instantly decided that they are better than the original ninja. And why? It's because the mayor says that the ninja are responsible for a bunch of property damage and destruction during fights, even though the bad guys would be the ones responsible for that stuff. Also, when it comes to the mayor, there was something else about him that I didn't enjoy during this season. When the ninja went to the mayor and asked him if they could get access to Asphira and her scepter in order to save Nia, the mayor didn't let them get access to that stuff. Even though when it comes to the ninja, like I said, they've saved Ninjago a bunch and they've defeated Asphira in the past, Plus, at the same time, when it comes to Asphira, she's weaker than she was during Season 11, and the ninja would be able to take her on in a fight. Plus, they needed the scepter and Asphira in order to save Nia, the savior of Ninjago who sacrificed herself fighting against Wajiro 1 year ago. For some reason, the mayor doesn't let them get access to the stuff that they need, which leads to the ninja doing all the stuff that leads to the prison storyline. So I wasn't the biggest fan of that when it came to the mayor, and then during part 2 of Crystalized, once the Overlord's forces show up, the mayor clearly didn't care about the people of Ninjago because he was planning on fleeing Ninjago City the first chance he got, and after the new ninja were turned into crystallized zombies, the mayor just ran away from Ninjago City, and we never saw him again. He never showed up at any other point during part 2 of Crystalized. He just disappeared. And overall, when it comes to the mayor during Crystalized, I really didn't like him. And at the same time, when it comes to the mayor, given all the stuff that happens with him during the season, I'm just left with one major question when it comes to this guy. How the heck did he get elected? I'm guessing he doesn't write his own speeches. However, speaking of the new ninja, Hound Dog McBrog and Mayor Trustable, that actually brings me into another major issue that I have with Crystalized, the prison storyline. I honestly don't think the prison storyline was handled well at all during the season, and here's why. For starters, the reason why the ninja are arrested doesn't make any sense in my opinion. When it comes to the ninja, they are arrested for saving Nia's life and helping her. Why are the ninja getting arrested? Yes, they did break Asphira out of jail and they did steal her scepter, but remember what I said earlier. The only reason why the ninja did any of that stuff in the first place is because the mayor wouldn't let them get access to Asphira and her scepter, which the ninja needed in order to save Nia in the first place. If the mayor had just let the ninja get access to that stuff, then none of this would have happened. So when it comes to the ninja being arrested, once again, I feel like it doesn't make a lot of sense. However, we then have stuff that happens with the ninja after they get arrested. And basically nothing happens. After the ninja go to Cryptarium Prison, nothing really happens with them. Like, the most that ends up happening is they meet up with Pythor and they learn about the Crystal King's plan, and that's pretty much it. Nothing major happens with the ninja after they get arrested. And after the ninja escape from Cryptarium Prison, once again, nothing really happens. The prison storyline ends up taking a back seat while a bunch of other storylines end up playing a bigger role during the season. So when it comes to the prison storyline, overall, not that much happened as a result of it, but then we have the ending of the prison storyline, which in my opinion also wasn't handled well. The prison storyline comes to an end during the episode The Return of the Ice Emperor, and during this episode, Lloyd saves Hound Dog McBrog from some crystallized serpentine, and that's it. That is how the prison storyline comes to an end. Lloyd saves Hound Dog McBrog, and that is literally it. The prison storyline comes to a very abrupt end, and overall, it doesn't feel very satisfying at all. It just kind of happens, and no one brings it up at any other point during the season. After Lloyd saves Hound Dog McBrog, we never see him interact with the ninja again. The mayor never talks to the ninja about them being fugitives. Again, the whole prison storyline just abruptly ends and nothing major happens with it. And overall, when it comes to the prison storyline, I honestly don't think this was handled well at all. And in comparison to Skybound's prison storyline, I honestly think that Skybound did a much better prison storyline. Moving on, another big issue that I have with Crystalized are the errors. One thing that I and a lot of other fans have pointed out when it comes to Crystalized are the animation and continuity errors during the season. And when it comes to every Ninjago season, it has some kind of animation error or continuity error at some point during the season. It's just something that happens, and overall, I don't have a big problem with that kind of thing. However, I do have a problem with that kind of stuff during Crystalized because of the amount of errors and how big some of them are. When it comes to the continuity errors during the season, there are a lot of them, especially during part 2, and some of them are very, very big errors. I'm not going to go over every single continuity error during the season, but I want to go over some of the more notable ones. For starters, during the season, Garmadon said that he was resurrected from the Cursed Realm. Even though that's not true, because the Oni trilogy and season 11 made it very, very clear that he was resurrected from the Departed Realm. Harumi said it during season 8, Garmadon said it during season 9, and Lloyd said it during season 11. So why is Garmadon saying the Cursed Realm all of a sudden? Now, yes, Garmadon was in the Cursed Realm when it was destroyed, but still, characters said the Departed Realm and not the Cursed Realm, so why is Garmadon changing things now? It doesn't make a lot of sense. For another example of a continuity error, during the season, multiple times Cole calls Vanya a princess even though she's a queen. And at one point during the season, Blazy H. Speed ends up calling Vanya a queen, and Cole says Princess Vanya of Shintaro. Even though Blazy was right, because Vanya is a queen. The ending of season 13 showed her coronation and her becoming Queen of Shintaro. Now, this continuity error is very different compared to all the other ones because the exact same thing happened during Seabound where Cole also called Vanya Princess, but still I wanted to point it out. And for one last continuity error, during the penultimate episode of Crystalized, the Overlord talked about the Great Devourer, and he said that he was the one who corrupted it in the first place. However, when it comes to the Great Devourer, the Overlord refers to it as a he, even though the Great Devourer is a she. We were told about this during Season 7, where it was revealed that the Vermilion Warriors were the firstborn offspring of the Great Devourer, meaning that the Great Devourer is a she, not a he. So overall, that really didn't make any sense, and overall, when it came to these continuity errors, I wasn't a big fan of them. Once again, because of how many of them there were, but also because of how big some of them were. And when it came to these continuity errors, they honestly became really distracting whenever I was watching the season. And I know I said that the Great Devourer thing was the last continuity error that I wanted to go over, but there's actually two other continuity errors that I want to talk about more in depth. And those would be the continuity errors related to the Oni. Crystalized handles stuff related to the Oni in a very, very different way compared to the stuff that we saw during the trilogy. For starters, we had the Oni themselves. During the events of Crystalized, the season was constantly presenting this idea, mainly through Lloyd, that the Oni were just bad guys, and all they could do is destroy. Lloyd even said during the events of Crystalized that the Oni are incapable of caring and all they do is destroy, while at the same time, the season was presenting the idea that the dragons were just the good guys and they couldn't do anything wrong. When it comes to Crystalized, they basically boiled the entire idea of the Oni and the dragon down to dragon good, Oni bad. That's it, and there's absolutely no middleman or wiggle room in between at all. Again, it's just dragon good, Oni bad. Even though, like I said earlier, we know for a fact that's not true, because Mistake was a full-blooded Oni, but she was still a good person. So when it comes to the season presenting this idea that Oni are just the bad guys, once again, we know for a fact that's not true. Now, I feel like this storyline could have worked if Lloyd realized that he was wrong about the Oni. Like I said, all throughout the season, Lloyd is constantly holding on to this idea that the Oni are just bad guys. And I feel like if Lloyd learned that he was wrong about the Oni, then this could have potentially worked. Except it didn't. All throughout the season, he was constantly against the idea of Oni doing good things and him using his Oni form. And like I said earlier, even when he did apologize to Garmadon, the most he ended up giving him was a maybe. Plus, at the same time, when it comes to the idea that the Oni are just bad guys, this directly goes against Garmadon's storyline. Because like I said, Garmadon's entire story revolves around him being an Oni, yet despite that, he's actively trying to change and he wants to become a good person. And I feel like with the season presenting this idea that Oni are just the bad guys, it completely goes against this idea. And if Lloyd realized that he was wrong about the Oni, then this storyline could have worked. But Lloyd didn't realize he was wrong about the Oni, and by the end of the season, he's still angry when it comes to his Oni form. So overall, when it comes to the Oni themselves during the season, I honestly don't think they were handled that well. However, that's not the only issue that I had with the Oni during the season. The other issue that I had with the Oni during the season was Oni power. Crystalized also presents a very different take on Oni power compared to what we saw during the trilogy. During the events of the trilogy, we were constantly presented with this idea that Oni power is based on conflict and fighting. However, during the events of Crystalized, we're instead presented with this idea that Oni power is based on anger, which isn't true at all. During the events of the trilogy, we saw multiple times that Oni power was based on conflict. We saw that during Season 8, where Garmadon got involved in multiple fights, thus allowing him to become stronger. During Season 10, we saw Garmadon battle against the ninja in order to get his powers back. And then we have Season 9, where I feel like the finale perfectly demonstrates my issues with Oni power during the events of Crystalized. During the fight against Garmadon, Garmadon tells Lloyd and Wu, and I quote, "The fight is what fuels me." And as a result of that, Lloyd decides to stop fighting against Garmadon, causing Garmadon to get weaker and weaker, and Lloyd is eventually able to get his own powers back. However, while Garmadon is getting weaker, he gets more and more angry. And according to Crystalized, shouldn't that make Garmadon stronger? According to Crystalized, yes, with Garmadon getting angrier, it means that he should become stronger. But he doesn't. Garmadon keeps on getting angry while he keeps on losing his powers, and he keeps on losing his powers. He doesn't hold on to his powers and they don't become stronger. He keeps on losing them because he's not fighting. Because Oni power isn't based on anger, it's based on conflict. And I'm just wondering, why exactly was this change made? It really doesn't make any sense at all, and it completely goes against everything that the trilogy established when it comes to Oni power. Now, yes, you could make the argument saying that when it comes to Lloyd and Garmadon, their powers are different from each other, meaning that when it comes to Lloyd, he needs anger in order to unlock his powers, meanwhile Garmadon needs conflicts. However, that's not true, and if anything, when it comes to the season, it actually presents the opposite idea that Lloyd and Garmadon's powers are one and the same. During episode 14 of Crystalized, Harumi tells Lloyd, and I quote, "Just like your father, anger makes you stronger." And that is what we see with Garmadon during the events of Crystalized. Whenever he's really angry, he's able to access his Oni form, and we see the exact same thing with Lloyd during the events of Crystalized. We see that during episode 14, and we see it during episode 30. So when it comes to Oni power, once again, I honestly don't think it was handled well during the season. And I'm just wondering, why were the properties of Oni power changed during Crystalized, considering how well the properties were established during the trilogy? It really doesn't make a lot of sense. And overall, when it comes to the Oni during Crystalized, I honestly don't think they were handled well during the season at all. Moving on, another big issue that I have with Crystalized would be the consequences, or rather the lack of consequences during the season. During the events of Crystalized, we end up seeing these major moments happening multiple times over the course of the season, and it seems like something really bad is going to happen to the characters in one way or another, but nothing does. Instead, when it comes to these moments, we end up getting fake-out deaths, and that's pretty much it. And when it comes to these fake-out deaths, there were a lot of them during the events of Crystalized. You had Nia during episode 2 after she remembered everything and she went up to the lighthouse. You had Nia at the end of episode 3 when she returned to the ninja. You had Nia 2 times after she was frozen because there was the possibility of her melting. You had the original 4 ninja when Harumi tried to kill them using the spider bombs. You had Nia again when she was in the monastery when all the spider bombs were in there. You had Sensei Wu after his battle against the Overlord when he was falling down to the city. You had Nia again after the Destiny's Bounty broke apart. You had Zayn, who had another fake-out death during the episode Compatible, and then you had Garmadon during the final episode of Crystalized, where he faked his death in order to try and motivate Lloyd to access his Oni form. There were so many fake-out deaths during the season, and by the end of the season, I honestly wasn't fooled by any of them because of how many fake-out deaths there were. However, that's not it, because in addition to there being no consequences during the season, this season also undoes consequences from previous seasons. Like, for example, Nia's sacrifice. That was a very big deal with Nia merging with the Ocean and her leaving the team. However, during the events of this season, Nia comes back, she becomes a human again, and she's able to regain her powers, undoing the consequences of her sacrifice. There was also Harumi's death during Season 9. That was undone during the season with Harumi coming back, and a lot more. And by the end of the season, there was really only one major consequence of everything happening: the ninja losing their powers. But even then, that didn't stick, because we have the book Quest for the Lost Powers, where the ninja end up getting their powers back. So overall, when it comes to Crystalized, I honestly don't think the idea of consequences were handled that well during the season. Another problem that I had with Crystalized was the way that the Council was handled during Part 2 of Crystalized. Like I said earlier, I honestly like the Council, and I feel like they were handled really well. However, when it comes to Part 2, I honestly don't think the Council was handled that well. Earlier, I talked about the mechanic and why I wasn't the biggest fan of him during Part 2, considering his dynamic with Nia, but that's not it. Another big issue that I have with the Council during Part 2 of Crystalized is the fact that the Council is barely in Part 2. We saw the Council a lot during Part 1 and during the in-between episodes. However, during Part 2, the Council was barely in the season. They made a couple of appearances here or there, but for the most part, they weren't in the season that much. Plus, another big issue that I had with the Council during Part 2 was their defeats towards the end of the season. During the episode Dragon Form, we saw the ninja take on each of the members of the Council, and eventually they were defeated and the ninja were able to get their golden weapons back. However, after each of the Council members were defeated, we never saw any of them at any other point. They just disappeared, and they were never seen for the rest of the episode, and they were never referenced at any point during episode 30. Again, they just disappeared from the season. Now, yes, I know that when it comes to Tommy Andreasen, the co-creator of the show, he said in an interview on the TTV YouTube channel that the Council members were arrested by the end of the season. But here's the thing, the show never hints at that happening at any point. Now, yes, when it comes to the Council members, they did lose their weapons and they were surrounded by good guys, but in my opinion, those don't really work as hints relating to the Council members getting arrested, because they could still escape while everything else was going on. And overall, when it comes to the fates of the Council members, I honestly don't think they were handled well. Especially Mr. F's, because according to Tommy Andreasen, Mr. F's fate is up to interpretation, and overall, I'm not the biggest fan of that. And when it comes to the Council in general, like I said, I honestly enjoyed them during Part 1 and during the in-between episodes. However, when it comes to Part 2, I honestly don't think the Council members were handled that well. Okay, I've been going over my issues with Crystalized for a while at this point, but now it's finally time for me to talk about it. Let's discuss the elephant in the room, Harumi. Now, when it comes to Harumi, overall, I'm honestly not a fan of her. I've made it pretty clear on my channel that I don't like Harumi, and I think she is the worst character in all of Ninjago. Harumi is my personal least favorite Ninjago character, and I really didn't like the way that she was handled during the events of Crystalized. For starters, we have Harumi's resurrection in the first place. Now, when it comes to Harumi's resurrection, I feel like this honestly undoes the consequences of her death from Season 9. However, at the same time, there's another big issue that I have when it comes to Harumi's resurrection. To me, Harumi's resurrection just feels lazy. The entire explanation that we get for Harumi's resurrection is this: the Overlord found Harumi in the departed realm and brought her back to life. that is it. That is basically all the explanation that we end up getting when it comes to Harumi's resurrection. And overall, I honestly feel like that's pretty lazy, especially in comparison to other resurrections that we've seen when it comes to Ninjago. Plus, at the same time, there's one other big thing that I need to bring up when it comes to this whole situation. We have never seen the Overlord resurrect any character at any point before this episode, and he never does it again at any other point after the episode. The Overlord just has the ability to resurrect the dead all of a sudden, and he uses it to resurrect Harumi and just her. And I'm wondering, how come the Overlord just now has the ability to resurrect the dead? Like I said earlier, we've never seen him do that at any point beforehand, but now he can just do it, and honestly, I'm not entirely sure why he can do that all of a sudden. And like I said, when it comes to Harumi's resurrection, overall, I didn't think it was handled well, and it just feels really lazy in my opinion. Moving on, there's something else that happens during episode 13 that I want to point out. During this episode, Harumi says something to the Overlord that doesn't make a lot of sense. During episode 13, Harumi says that she can't work for the Overlord because he'll destroy everything. And this is another big issue that I have with Harumi during the events of Crystalized. Harumi's actions during the Oni trilogy are never brought up at any point during this season. Crystalized just ignores all the terrible stuff that Harumi's done over the events of the show, and as a result, it creates moments like this that don't make any sense at all. Because when it comes to Harumi saying that the Overlord will destroy everything, that makes her a hypocrite. Because Harumi destroyed a lot of stuff during Season 8. She blew up the Palace of Secrets, which resulted in the death of the Emperor and Empress of Ninjago, her adopted parents, and she let the Oni Titan rampage during the Season 8 finale. Harumi has definitely destroyed things during the events of the trilogy. So once again, when it comes to Harumi saying this, it just makes her a hypocrite. Also at the same time, this also relates into another issue that I have with Harumi during the events of the season. During the events of Crystalized, Harumi acts like she's done nothing wrong. Over the events of the show, Harumi does these terrible and awful things. However, Harumi shows no signs of sympathy and remorse for these actions, and she acts like she does nothing wrong when it comes to the show. Even though, like I said, she's done a lot of really terrible things, Harumi acts like she did nothing wrong, and we're seeing that right here during this moment when she's talking to the Overlord. So overall, I honestly don't think that was handled well when it came to the season. And there is one last thing about episode 13 that I want to point out. Towards the end of the episode, Lloyd ends up revealing that he went back to try and find Harumi after the building collapsed on her after his battle against Garmadon. But here's the thing, this moment doesn't make any sense, mainly because this moment ends up contradicting some big things when it comes to Season 9. For starters, this contradicts Lloyd's character during Season 9 because during Season 9, Lloyd was doing whatever he could to fight back against Harumi, and he was doing whatever he could to not be manipulated by her. And we saw that multiple times during Season 9, so Lloyd going back to try and find Harumi doesn't make a lot of sense. Plus, at the same time, this also doesn't make any sense considering what was actually going on during the Season 9 finale. During the Season 9 finale, Lloyd was focusing on trying to defeat Garmadon and stopping him, and it didn't seem like he was thinking about going back to try and find Harumi at any point during the final episode. Plus, at the same time, when it comes to Lloyd, he was taking his time fighting against Garmadon, especially when he decided to stop fighting against Garmadon, which caused Garmadon to become weaker. Plus, at the same time when it came to Lloyd during that episode, by the end of the episode after Garmadon was defeated, we saw him with the rest of the team walking away from Borg Tower. And we didn't see Lloyd running off to go and try and find Harumi or anything. Again, he was with the rest of the team. So when it comes to this reveal, it really doesn't make a lot of sense in my opinion because it contradicts some major things when it comes to Season 9. Moving on to episode 14, that's where we got the conversation between Lloyd and Harumi that I brought up earlier. However, when it comes to this episode, there's something else that I want to point out. This episode makes it very, very clear that when it comes to Harumi, she is willingly doing all of these terrible things, and she's doing them because she wants to do it. During the episode, Harumi forces Lloyd to watch the death of the original 4 ninja again. And during this episode, Harumi straight up tells Lloyd that she can deactivate the explosives, but she won't. Harumi knows for a fact that she can deactivate the spider bombs and not try to kill the ninja, however, she tries to kill the original 4 ninja anyway. And it's not like she's being forced to do this. The Overlord isn't making her do this thing. She is doing this because she wants to do it. Plus, at the same time during the episode, Harumi even laughs at the idea of her changing, once again making it clear that when it comes to Harumi, she is willingly doing all of these terrible things. She's not being forced to do any of this stuff by the Overlord. And I want you to keep that in mind because of something that happens later on during the season. Moving on, we then have episode 16 of Crystalized, where during this episode, Harumi tells Lloyd that the monastery has been blown up and everyone inside of it is dead. And while she's doing this, she talks about her parents and how they were killed by the Great Devourer. And there's something that I want to point out when it comes to this moment. While Harumi is talking about the Great Devourer, Pythor is standing right next to her. And in case you guys are newer to the fanbase and you don't know, Pythor was the one responsible for unleashing the Great Devourer in the first place. He was the reason why the Great Devourer went on its rampage, yet when it comes to Harumi, she has absolutely no problem working with Pythor. She sees no issue working with the guy responsible for unleashing the Great Devourer in the first place. In fact, when it comes to Pythor unleashing the Great Devourer, that's never brought up at any point during the season. And I think that's kind of weird because the Great Devourer is referenced a couple times during the season. There's this episode, but then there's also episode 29. But again, Pythor being the one to unleash the Great Devourer is never brought up. And I think it's pretty weird that when it comes to Harumi, she has no issue working alongside Pythor. And once again, I want you to keep that in mind because of something that happens later on during the season. We then have episode 17, and during this episode, things don't make any sense. Because during this episode, the Overlord wants Lloyd to be killed, and all the members of the council go out to try and do that. Except Harumi. Because all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Harumi is against the idea of Lloyd dying and him even being hurt. At one point during the episode, she actually directs the council away from the direction that Lloyd went. And when it comes to Harumi acting this way during the episode, it doesn't make any sense at all. During the previous episodes, we saw that Harumi had absolutely no issue trying to hurt Lloyd, and that's exactly what happens. And during the next episode, we see Harumi trying to hurt Lloyd multiple times. And during seasons 8 and 9, we saw the exact same thing. Harumi did whatever she could to try and hurt Lloyd during the trilogy. In fact, during season 8, Harumi even tried to kill Lloyd multiple times. So Harumi all of a sudden not wanting Lloyd to die doesn't make any sense. Especially since it's never explained why Harumi is against the idea of Lloyd dying. And from the way that I see things, there's one of two possibilities. Either A, Harumi feels bad for Lloyd and she wants to help him, something that doesn't make any sense and contradicts everything we've seen when it comes to Harumi's character, or B, Harumi wants to keep Lloyd alive so that way she can manipulate him more, which makes a lot more sense. But again, we are never given a reason why Harumi is against the idea of Lloyd dying. And then by the end of the episode, for some reason, Lloyd decides to grab onto Harumi and jump off the Oni Temple with her. And once again, this is never explained and no character brings it up at any point during the season. All the members of the council saw this and they never bring it up, Harumi never brings it up, and Lloyd never brings it up. So I'm wondering, why did Lloyd do that? Why did he grab onto Harumi and jump off the Oni Temple with her, and how come that moment is never explained? It doesn't make any sense at all. Moving on, we then have episode 18, where things during this episode also feel weird, but for a different reason. During this episode, Lloyd is really angry at Harumi. He's doing whatever he can to not be manipulated by her, and Lloyd is basically done with Harumi. At one point, he even calls out Harumi, saying that she's filled with nothing but anger and hatred and fear. And in my opinion, this makes perfect sense. It makes sense given all the terrible stuff that Harumi has done to Lloyd over the events of the show, and it also makes sense considering Lloyd's Wild Brain character arc, which revolved around him getting over Harumi and moving on from her. So Lloyd acting this way during the episode makes total sense. Except, here's the thing. This is the only episode where Lloyd is like this. In basically every other episode that features Lloyd and Harumi, Lloyd is constantly fixating on the idea of Harumi changing, except this episode. This was the only exception. There were some moments in other episodes where Lloyd was angry at Harumi, but this is the only episode that really feels consistent with Lloyd's characterization from the previous seasons. And when it comes to Harumi during this episode, she's trying to manipulate Lloyd during the episode, and she does it by flirting with him. And overall, I wasn't the biggest fan of that for two big reasons. For starters, when it comes to these moments, they honestly felt really forced when it came to the episode, so I wasn't a big fan of that. But the other big reason why I'm not a fan of these moments is because of something that happens during Season 9. During the Season 9 episode 2 Lies One Truth, Harumi presented Garmadon with the idea of him adopting her, and Garmadon ultimately accepted that, making Harumi his daughter, and by extension Lloyd's sister. Meaning that when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi, the two of them are related to each other because they're brother and sister. Tommy Andreasen even acknowledged this during his interview on the TTV YouTube channel, saying that Lloyd and Harumi are adopted brother and sister. So overall, when it comes to this whole thing with Harumi flirting with Lloyd, I really didn't like it. Also, there's one other thing that I want to point out when it comes to Harumi during this episode. During the episode, Harumi has absolutely no problem with hurting Lloyd, and the two of them get involved in multiple fights during the episode, even though during the previous episode, Harumi was against the idea of Lloyd dying and him being hurt. So when it comes to Harumi's character during this episode, it doesn't make a lot of sense given the way she was handled during the previous episode, but given the stuff that Harumi did during the episodes before that, it does make sense. And when it comes to Harumi's character in general during the season, I honestly feel like it wasn't handled very consistently during the season. Moving on, we then have episode 19, and during this episode, the Overlord says something that doesn't make any sense at all. During this episode, the Overlord says that Harumi still has feelings for Lloyd, and I have a lot of problems and questions when it comes to this line, but there is one major question that I have overall. What does the Overlord mean by still? The entire point of Harumi's plan and her ruse during Season 9 was her pretending to have feelings for Lloyd and her manipulating him into having feelings for her. Also that way, when she ultimately betrayed Lloyd, the betrayal would hurt even harder. That was the entire point of her ruse in the first place. So when it comes to the Overlord suggesting that Harumi actually had feelings for Lloyd, it doesn't make any sense, especially considering all the terrible stuff that we saw Harumi do to Lloyd over the events of the trilogy. Lloyd and Harumi got involved in multiple fights during the season. Harumi manipulated Lloyd a lot during the season. She forced him to watch the death of the original four ninja and Sensei Wu. She forced him to fight against his own dad, and so many other awful things during the events of the season. And Harumi made it very clear during these episodes that she was doing all of this because she hated Lloyd and she wanted him to suffer. During the episode Game of Masks, Harumi told Lloyd, "I want you to feel the emptiness that I feel. Your father will return, but he won't be the man you remember." During the episode Dread on Arrival, Harumi told Lloyd, "There was never anything between us." And then during the season 8 finale, after Harumi forced Lloyd to watch the death of the 4 original ninja and Sensei Wu, a moment that brought Lloyd to tears and made him cry, Harumi straight up told Lloyd, "This is what I wanted. To see your father return and for you to lose everything. How does it feel to see the end?" So this one line doesn't make any sense at all, and it completely contradicts everything that we've seen Harumi do over the events of the show. Moving on, we then have episode 20, and even though Harumi didn't appear during the episode, there is something that I want to point out. During this episode, when Garmadon is told about Harumi, Garmadon says that Harumi was like a daughter to him. But here's my question. Why does Garmadon say that Harumi was like a daughter to him? Because Harumi wasn't like a daughter to Garmadon. Harumi is Garmadon's daughter. Like I said earlier, Garmadon adopted Harumi during the season 9 episode 2 Lines 1 Truth. So when it comes to Garmadon saying this, it doesn't make a lot of sense at all. Since again, Harumi wasn't like Garmadon's daughter. Harumi is Garmadon's daughter. And then we have the final 2 episodes of Crystalized, and I really didn't like what the season did with Harumi during these episodes. During the penultimate episode of Crystalized, the Overlord revealed that he was the one who corrupted the Great Devourer. This causes Harumi to get really angry at the Overlord, thus causing her to fight against him, effectively giving Harumi a redemption. And overall, I don't think that this storyline was handled well at all, and I have so many problems with this redemption. For starters, Harumi's anger at the Overlord doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, yes, I do understand that when it comes to Harumi, she's angry at the Overlord because he's the one who corrupted the Great Devourer, and the Great Devourer was the thing responsible for killing her parents. But remember what I said earlier. Harumi had absolutely no issue working alongside Pythor, the guy responsible for unleashing the Great Devourer in the first place. So Harumi has no problems working alongside Pythor, even though he was the one responsible for unleashing the Great Devourer. But she does have problems working alongside the Overlord, the guy responsible for corrupting the Great Devourer. Like, when it comes to the Overlord and Pythor, the two of them are both equally responsible for her parents dying because of the Great Devourer. The Overlord was the one responsible for corrupting the Great Devourer in the first place, and Pythor was the one responsible for unleashing the Great Devourer. So again, when it comes to Harumi's anger, it doesn't make a lot of sense considering what we saw earlier on during the season. However, that's not all. Another big issue that I have with Harumi's redemption is that there is no build-up to it. When it comes to Harumi's redemption, this moment just happens during the final 2 episodes of Crystalized. And there was never a moment that set up the idea of Harumi swapping sides or fighting alongside the ninja at any point during the season. There were some moments where it seemed like Harumi was maybe thinking about swapping sides, but when it came to those moments, those happened earlier on during the season, and in between those moments and this happening, Harumi kept on doing evil things and she was completely loyal to the Overlord. So her all of a sudden going against the Overlord doesn't make a lot of sense, especially since, again, there really isn't any build-up for this moment at all when it comes to the season. Outside of very small moments, but even then when it comes to those small moments, they happen in between Harumi doing these truly terrible things during the events of Crystalized. And finally, the last big issue that I have when it comes to the setup for Harumi's redemption is the reasoning behind it. The entire reason why Harumi ended up swapping sides and fighting alongside the ninja is because the Overlord revealed that he was the one who corrupted the Great Devourer. And this is what the season bases Harumi's redemption around. A last-minute, out-of-nowhere reveal that feels really forced. The Overlord had absolutely no reason to reveal the fact that he was the one who corrupted the Great Devourer. He was fighting against Lloyd and Garmadon, and Harumi was standing right next to him. The Overlord had literally no reason to reveal the fact that he was the one who corrupted the Great Devourer, especially since the season implies that the Overlord had been watching over Harumi for a while, so I think it's safe to say that the Overlord would have known that Harumi was affected by the Great Devourer, so why did he say this in the first place? It doesn't make any sense at all. Also, when it comes to Harumi fighting against the Overlord, she's doing it for entirely selfish reasons. Harumi isn't fighting against the Overlord because she realizes what she's been doing is wrong. She's not doing it out of the goodness of her heart. She's not even doing it because the Overlord has been forcing her to do all these terrible things, and this was the first chance she had to fight against him. All throughout the events of Crystalized, it was made very clear that Harumi was willingly working alongside the Overlord, and she was doing all this terrible stuff because she wanted to do it. During episode 13 of Crystalized, Harumi talked to the Overlord and she said that she wouldn't work for him because he would destroy everything. Harumi knew for a fact that the Overlord was a bad guy, and if she worked for him, it would result in bad things happening. And for the remainder of the season, we saw Harumi doing these terrible and awful things, not because she was forced to do it, but because she wanted to do it. Like I said earlier, episode 14 made it very clear that Harumi was willingly doing all of these terrible things. So when it comes to the reasoning behind Harumi's redemption, it doesn't make any sense, and the entire thing basically boils down to Harumi blaming someone else for her problems. That is basically the setup for Harumi's redemption in the first place. It's just her getting mad at the Overlord and then directing all of her anger at him. However, that's not all. After the Overlord is defeated and Lloyd, Garmadon, and Harumi reunite with the rest of the ninja, the original 4 ninja are understandably very angry at Harumi, as each of the ninja end up giving her an angry look. But Lloyd tells the ninja it's okay, she's with us. And this is the closest we ever get to Harumi taking any accountability for her actions. Harumi's done so many terrible and awful things over the events of the show. However, after she did one good thing by fighting against the Overlord, the show acts like Harumi's never done anything wrong before this, and the show acts like Harumi's been completely absolved of all the terrible stuff that she's done, even though Harumi has done so many terrible and awful things over the events of the show. She's been a part of multiple evil groups who wanted to take over Ninjago. She's resurrected some of Ninjago's greatest villains. She's actually taken over Ninjago by force multiple times during the events of the show. She's fought against and she's tried to kill the ninja multiple times. She's treated Lloyd absolutely terribly. Some of her actions have resulted in innocent people dying, like the Emperor and Empress of Ninjago, her adopted parents, and you could even make the argument that when it comes to Harumi, she was the one responsible for the crystal apocalypse happening in the first place, with her working for the Overlord, and so many other awful things. However, when it comes to the season, all of those actions are completely ignored because Harumi did one good thing. And while yes, Harumi did do one good thing, just because she did do one good thing, that's not enough to make up for all the terrible stuff that she's done over the events of the show. Plus, there's one other thing that I want to point out when it comes to this whole situation. This season ends up ignoring a major reason why Harumi became a villain in the first place. While, yes, the Great Devourer killing her parents was a reason why Harumi became a villain, that wasn't the only reason. Another big reason why Harumi became a villain is because as a result of her parents dying, Harumi grew to have issues with the ninja. Issues that, by the way, are never brought up or resolved at any point during the season. Crystalized completely ignores all of them, and for some reason it shows Harumi and the ninja being on good terms with each other by the end of the season. For some reason. It doesn't make any sense at all, and it contradicts a lot of major things when it comes to Harumi. And when it comes to Harumi's redemption, overall, I really don't think it's handled well, but there's also one last major issue that I have when it comes to Harumi's redemption. This isn't even a redemption for Harumi. There's a reason why I've been putting Harumi's redemption in air quotes, and that's because I honestly don't think this is a redemption for Harumi at all. The entire thing basically boils down to Harumi blaming someone else for her problems, and then she takes no accountability for her own actions. Because that is exactly what we see. The only reason why Harumi decides to swap sides is because the Overlord reveals something that directly affected her. That's the only reason why Harumi decided to fight against the Overlord. And then after this happened, Harumi acted like she did nothing wrong beforehand, and all because she did one good thing, the show acted like she did nothing wrong before this. And at the same time, the season completely ignores all the major issues that Harumi had with the ninja. So overall, when it comes to Harumi's redemption, it really isn't a redemption at all. Again, it's basically just Harumi blaming someone else for her problems, and then she acts like she did nothing wrong. So overall, I really don't think this was handled well at all during the events of Crystalized. And there is one last major issue that I have when it comes to Harumi during the events of Crystalized. By the end of Crystalized, when we see a bunch of characters helping to rebuild the monastery, we see that Harumi is one of these characters. And according to Tommy Andreasen in that interview that I talked about earlier, he said that when it comes to Harumi's fate during this episode, it is up to interpretation. And that goes for whether or not Harumi was arrested by the end of the season, whether or not she was redeemed by the end of the season, and whether or not her and Lloyd got together during the season. And in my opinion, this doesn't make any sense at all. Given all the truly terrible and horrible things that Harumi has done during the events of the show, and all the harm that she's caused Ninjago, in my opinion, her fate being up to interpretation all because she did one good thing for purely selfish reasons, doesn't make any sense at all. In my opinion, when it comes to Harumi, she was not redeemed by the end of Crystalized, and I feel like she should get arrested given everything that she's done. And when it comes to the idea of her and Lloyd getting together, I don't think that should happen at all. Lloyd and Harumi have a super toxic and abusive relationship when it comes to the show, with Harumi doing whatever she can to hurt Lloyd, and she's caused Lloyd so much pain and suffering as a result of her actions. And when it comes to Lloyd, he's gone through so much trauma as a result of all the truly horrible things that Harumi has done to him. And so leaving the fate of these two getting together up to interpretation all because Harumi did one good thing, that doesn't make any sense at all, and at the same time, it completely goes against both of their characters and their stories. When it comes to Harumi, it makes no sense given all the terrible stuff that she's done to Lloyd over the events of the show, and the fact that the show has made it very clear that Harumi hates Lloyd and she wants him to suffer, so her being on good terms with Lloyd doesn't make any sense. And when it comes to Lloyd, it doesn't make any sense given all the terrible stuff that Harumi has done to him, and it makes even less sense given Lloyd's Wild Brain arc, which revolved around him getting over Harumi and moving on from her. If Lloyd and Harumi end up getting together at some point in the future, it means that all of the character development that Lloyd went through during the Wild Brain era of the show would have been absolutely pointless. Because why have this massive arc revolving around Lloyd getting over Harumi and moving on from her if the two of them are just gonna get together at some point in the future? It makes literally no sense, and in my opinion is really bad writing, and at the same time, I feel like that sends a terrible message to the people who are watching the episode. I even made an entire video a while back going over why Lloyd and Harumi getting together in the future is a bad idea. And I really hope that in the future of the franchise, we don't see Lloyd and Harumi get together, and Lloyd ends up realizing that him and Harumi being together isn't a good thing, and he's able to fully move on from her. I think that would honestly make a lot of sense, and I feel like that would honestly send a good message about abusive relationships and how they aren't good. So when it comes to the whole thing of Harumi's fate being left up to interpretation all because she fought against the Overlord, in my opinion, that doesn't make any sense at all. So overall, when it comes to Harumi, I honestly don't think she was handled well at all during the season. I feel like Harumi's resurrection honestly wasn't handled well. There were so many things related to Harumi during the season that didn't make any sense and contradicted stuff that we saw from previous seasons, especially when it came to stuff revolving around Lloyd, and when it came to Harumi's redemption during the final 2 episodes, it wasn't handled well at all, with the entire redemption basically boiling down to Harumi blaming someone else for her problems and then she takes no accountability for her own actions, essentially not even being a redemption at all. And when it comes to Harumi's fate being left up to interpretation all because of that redemption, in my opinion, that doesn't make any sense at all. However, when it comes to Harumi, she wasn't actually my biggest problem with the season, because there's one other major problem that I had with Crystalized. However, when it comes to this problem, it's actually a lot more personal. So, let's get into that. For me, my biggest issue with Crystalized was the way that Ice Chapter stuff was handled. Now, I know that may sound strange, but like I said, this was a much more personal issue. And that's because the Ice Chapter is my personal favorite Ninjago season. I've made it pretty clear over my channel that I think the Ice Chapter is a very underrated season, and I feel like there is honestly a lot of really great things about the Ice Chapter. I really like this season, and I did not like the way things related to this season were handled during Crystalized. For example, this season barely gets any representation. Every other Wild Brain season gets some big form of representation in one form or another, such as characters returning or storylines from those seasons being continued during this season. Meanwhile, when it comes to the Ice Chapter, this season got, at most, small references and one returning character. And that one returning character wasn't handled well at all during this season. So let's talk about that character. Meaning we have to talk about the episode, The Return of the Ice Emperor. When it comes to Return of the Ice Emperor, this episode was basically the most the Ice Chapter ended up getting during the season. And when it comes to this episode, it genuinely felt like a slap in the face. For starters, even though this episode is called The Return of the Ice Emperor doesn't return until halfway through the episode. And then after that, the Ice Emperor is barely in the episode. He's in the episode for a couple of minutes, and that's pretty much it. And whenever the Ice Emperor is in the episode, he is turned into an unfunny joke. During the events of the Ice Chapter, the Ice Emperor was a very serious character. He was an evil warlord who took over the Neverrealm by force and plunged it into an eternal winter. That was a very big deal when it came to the Ice Chapter, and the Ice Emperor was treated very seriously during the season. Meanwhile, when it comes to Crystalized, it's just another episode where Zane adopts a persona for the episode. And overall, when it comes to these episodes, I'm honestly not the biggest fan of them, and when it comes to this episode in particular, I really don't like it. Because when it comes to the Ice Emperor, like I said, he's turned into an unfunny joke during the episode. He just annoys Pixel, and that's pretty much it. And overall, I really don't like that the Ice Emperor was handled this way during the season. However, there's one last major issue that I have when it comes to the Ice Emperor during this episode. Why was he even in the episode? This episode does nothing to continue the Ice Emperor storyline in any way. The Ice Emperor is just brought back, he becomes an unfunny joke, and then he just disappears for the rest of the season. What was the point of bringing back the Ice Emperor and naming the episode after him if the Ice Emperor storyline was never going to be brought up or continued in any way? In my opinion, that doesn't make any sense at all. Plus, at the same time, I feel like this honestly could have worked well with the storyline, considering Zane's storyline revolving around him turning off his emotions. When it comes to the Ice Emperor returning, that could have been something really interesting as a result of Zane reactivating his emotions. But we didn't get that. Instead, when it came to this episode, we just got the Ice Emperor back for a couple of minutes, and he was annoying Pixel. And overall, I really didn't like that. Oh yeah, also during this episode, there were a couple references to other Ice Chapter characters, and that was pretty much it. Overall, when it comes to Return of the Ice Emperor, I really don't like this episode, and like I said, this episode honestly felt like a slap in the face. However, that's not it, because there's one other big issue that I have when it comes to Ice Chapter related stuff during the season, and that is stuff related to Akita. Akita is one of my personal favorite Ninjago characters, and I really like her. I even made an entire video a while back talking about Akita, explaining why I think she's an amazing character. However, I didn't like the way stuff related to her was handled during the season. For starters, Akita never appears at any point during the season. Now yes, every other NetherRealm character also doesn't appear during the season, however, there's a reason why I'm pointing out Akita in particular. It's because the ending of the Ice chapter set up her return. At the very end of the Ice chapter during the final episode, we heard Akita talking, and she was talking about seeing Lloyd again, and she said the line, "Never is a very long time." This set up the idea of her returning and her and Lloyd reuniting. However, after the events of Season 11, Akita never appeared again during the show, and she wasn't even referenced. And I was hoping that during the events of Crystalized, she would finally return after all this time. But she didn't. Every other Wild Brain Ninja ally made an appearance during the season, except Akita. She was the only one that didn't. Instead, the closest that we ever got to Akita appearing during the season was a cameo that wasn't even her. It was Zane's hologram disguise malfunctioning, causing him to look like Akita for a few seconds. And that was the closest we had ever gotten to seeing Akita back in the show after 3 years. And I have a lot of questions relating to Akita not appearing during the season. For starters, why wasn't Akita brought back during the season? Every other Wild Brain Ninja ally returned during the season, so why not bring Akita back? Especially since her return was set up at the end of the Ice chapter, and Akita's the only ninja ally to have any real setup for her return. So not having her in this season doesn't make a lot of sense. Plus, at the same time, we've seen that allies from other realms have the ability to come back. We saw that during Season 10 with Faith and Firstborn showing up in Ninjago. The two of them were from the first realm and they were able to return, so again, why not bring Akita back? Also, we know that when it comes to the NetherRealm, there isn't any kind of time difference between it and Ninjago. Tommy Andreessen has confirmed multiple times on Twitter that there is no time difference between the NetherRealm and Ninjago, and the two realms flow at the exact same time rates. So when it comes to Akita and all the characters in the NetherRealm, they aren't dead, so again, I'm just wondering, why wasn't Akita brought back during the season? And the same thing goes for every other NetherRealm character. Why bring back every single Wild Brain Ninja ally during the season and have them participate in the final battle except the NetherRealm characters? Why exclude them from all this? It really doesn't make a lot of sense, especially considering how much stuff from the Wild Brain era of the show we see during this season. And in my opinion, it feels really weird not to include anything from the Ice chapter. It really doesn't make a lot of sense. However, that's not it, because there's another big issue that I have when it comes to Akita related stuff during the season, and that is stuff that relates to Lloyd. For a while, I've been talking about Lloyd going through this big character arc revolving around him getting over Harumi and moving on from her. Yeah, that entire character arc started with Akita. The entire Wild Brain character arc for Lloyd started during the Ice chapter when he met Akita and the two of them traveled together over the course of the Ice chapter. Akita was the one who helped Lloyd learn to see the good in other people, overcome his trust issues, and take the first steps necessary to move on from Harumi. Lloyd's entire Wild Brain character arc started with Akita, and the entire point of Lloyd and Akita's Ice Chapter storyline revolved around the two of them overcoming their trauma from stuff they went through in the past and learning to get over it. And when it came to Lloyd in particular, it related to him letting go of his obsessions surrounding his failures when it came to Harumi. And during this season, it completely goes against that by having Lloyd constantly fixating on the idea of Harumi changing and her becoming a better person. This completely goes against the entire point of the Lloyd Nikita storyline, especially the ending of it. When it comes to Lloyd Nikita's Ice Chapter storyline, it came to an end during the final episode of the Ice Chapter when Nikita gave Lloyd a kiss on the cheek. And in my opinion, this was the perfect way that their Ice Chapter storyline could have ended, because this moment is meant to show how much the two of them have grown over the course of the season, and it's also meant to show how close the two of them have become over the course of the season. Lloyd and Nikita both had a major impact on each other during the events of the Ice Chapter, with the two of them helping the other one overcome their trust issues and let go of an idea that they had been holding on to for a while during the events of the Ice Chapter. For Akita, that was revenge, and when it comes to Lloyd, like I said, it was his obsession surrounding his failures with Harumi. And at the same time, this moment is also meant to show just how close the two of them had become over the course of the Ice Chapter. This moment is meant to show how much Akita loves Lloyd, and when it comes to Lloyd, it's meant to show him taking comfort in his loved ones and the people who care about him, with Lloyd knowing that there are people out there who can and want to help him. Yet, when it comes to Crystalized, it completely goes against this entire idea by having Lloyd constantly fixating on the idea of Harumi changing all throughout the season, and then by the end of the season, validating that by actually having Harumi swap sides and fight alongside the ninja, and then the ending of the season leaves Harumi's fate up to interpretation, all because she did one good thing. This entire situation makes absolutely no sense, and it completely goes against the entire point of the Lloyd Nikita storyline, which revolved around the two of them overcoming their trauma, and when it came to Lloyd, it was specifically revolving around him moving on from Harumi and getting over her. That was a major thing that Lloyd learned during the Ice Chapter, and it was the entire point of his Wild Brain character arc. But when it comes to Crystalized, it completely went against all that, and it has Lloyd and Harumi ending up on good terms by the end of the season, all because Harumi did one good thing for purely selfish reasons. This entire situation makes no sense. And overall, when it comes to Ice Chapter related stuff during the season, I really didn't like it, and I don't think any of this stuff was handled well at all during the season. So, overall, when it comes to Crystalized, what are my thoughts on this season? When it comes to Crystalized, if I had to describe it in one word, it would be disappointing. Honestly, when it comes to Crystalized, I really wanted to like this season, and I feel like Crystalized had the potential to be one of Ninjago's best seasons. This season had a lot of things going for it, and I feel like if some things were handled differently, then this season could have been something truly amazing. But instead, when it came to Crystalized, in my opinion, this season wasn't good. We got character moments that contradicted stuff from previous seasons, storylines that weren't handled well, decisions that didn't make a lot of sense, and so much more. And overall, when it comes to Crystalized, I'm honestly not a fan of this season. There were some things about the season that I enjoyed, like I said at the very beginning of the video, but overall, when it comes to this season, I really don't like Crystalized, and in my opinion, this is one of the worst Ninjago seasons of all time. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. If you guys have made it this far, thank you so much. At the time of me making this video, this is currently the longest video that I have ever made on my channel. And I just want to say thank you all so much for watching this video. And that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So tell me down below what do you guys think. Tell me, was there anything that I left out when it came to Crystalized? Again, tell me down below, and I hope you guys enjoyed. Later, guys. This is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.